These two gentlemen behind me need no introduction. In fact, we saw a lot of them in the last 3 days. That's Praggnanandha of India and Magnus Carlsen of Norway playing the final of the Chess World Cup. Now, considering that these two went at each other for a duration of 3 days, going the full distance, in fact, of that final, it would tell you that the first thing that will be on their mind is the kind of competition that they got from each other. Remember, they played 2 classical games, and then because there was no result achieved in the 2 classical games, it went to the rapid round of chess, which is effectively a tiebreaker onto the 3rd day. So they were competing against each other, and you would have thought that if you were to ask Magnus Carlsen right after the final, which is that one player that is on his mind, which is that one player that he feels is going to trouble him for a very long time, you would have thought that that would have been Prag, but not quite. Carlsen, in fact, has picked another player. This is his reaction right after that World Cup final that Magnus Carlsen won, which interestingly was the very first time that he's won that tournament. So who is Carlsen talking about? So when asked as to which was his best match or the most memorable match of the World Cup, he picked the match against another Indian grandmaster in Gukesh. And he said, I felt like I had my best day and game of the event against Gukesh. He is extremely strong, and he was sort of unlucky to have faced me that one day when I really showed my best. So just a bit of a recap for you. Carlsen played India's Gukesh, who is just 17 years of age, in the quarterfinals of the World Cup. There the match was decided in classical chess itself. It did not have to go to the rapid round. So there, now it's interesting what he talks about. He says that Gukesh is extremely strong, and he feels that Gukesh on that day was unlucky that he faced a Magnus Carlsen. He's not really, in that sense, praising himself. What Magnus Carlsen is saying, that on that day of the quarterfinal, he was at his best, which is why he was able to beat Gukesh. He feels that had he not been at his best on that day, probably Gukesh would have prevailed over him. So he's in that sense saying Gukesh is such a good player that I had to be at my best, and I was at my best on that day, which is why I managed to beat Gukesh. Very interestingly, he does not say that about Praggnanandha, because we know that on the day of that World Cup final, on those 2 days of classical chess, Magnus Carlsen wasn't at his best because physically he was completely down. We know that he was suffering from a stomach bug, so was not at his best. Most chess experts might point out that had he been at his best, maybe that World Cup final also would have been decided in the classical format, wouldn't have gone to the rapid format. So he says his best and the most memorable performance came against Gukesh. He further goes on to praise Gukesh, where he says, and this is high praise coming from Carlsen himself. He says Gukesh is clearly the strongest classical player right now. So in classical chess, in conventional chess, he is the strongest player in the world, and that's a lot of praise for Gukesh. Just to let you know a bit about Gukesh, he's 17 years of age. He was in the news very recently because he crossed the 2,700 mark in the ELO ratings, and with that went past Vishwanathan Anand and has become now India's #1 player in chess, going past Vishwanathan Anand. It's not the first time a grandmaster has gone past Vishwanathan Anand. Hari Krishna went past Vishwanathan Anand in 2016, but that was for a very brief period. He could not sustain it. Gukesh has gone past Vishwanathan Anand, which means he's India's #1 and currently ranked 11 in the world. His ranking is 11. He's had some very good outings leading up to the World Cup. In the quarterfinal, came up against Magnus Carlsen, and that too, the Magnus Carlsen in his best form. But Carlsen himself says that Gukesh is the strongest classical chess player right now, as is evident by his ELO rating. So clearly the future of Indian chess is very bright. But he did not stop there. he did talk about Indian chess, and he did talk about Praggnanandha. He says Prag is strong but also a mentality monster. Now what does he mean by a mentality monster? He means to say that Prag, despite the fact that he had such a hectic World Cup. Now remember, there are 128 players participating in that tournament. Just reaching the final can be exhausting, and he knows that unlike Magnus Carlsen, who effectively got most of his results barring one which went to the third day, the rapid round, other than that Magnus finished most of his opponents in the classical chess, that is 2 days. Prag had to go past 3 rounds of rapid format. That means he had a much tiresome workload going into the final, and going into such a long tournament's final is commendable by itself, and that is what he is praising when he is calling him a mentality monster, as in to have that mental strength to keep coming back day after day after playing such tough matches, and then have the physical and the mental energy to be competing in the final. And that is something that Carlsen is in awe of, and that is what he feels stands out about Prag. So alongside Prag, alongside Gukesh that I just mentioned, you have a lot of young Indian players really coming up, and that is great sign for Indian chess. In fact, Carlsen later in that interview where he spoke about Gukesh, about Prag, he goes on to say that he's finally happy that this next generation born after the 2000s is now beginning to dominate, because his generation, the generation before Prag and Gukesh, that is the Carlsen's generation, competed for very long, and they did not find any successor. They didn't find any youngster who could come and replace them. But now he feels that the new generation that is coming up are the generation of players that will now replace the world number 1s, 2s, 3s that we see, which are all part of the Magnus Carlsen generation. So as an Indian sport fan, as an Indian chess fan, there is a lot to be proud of after all the things that Magnus Carlsen has said. For more such sports related updates and videos, don't forget to subscribe to Sports Today. For the moment, Nikhil Nas signing off. Bye bye.